Hello, I am Stephen J. Childs of virtualvoicelessons.net, and I would like to welcome you today to our continuation of our vocal health series entitled Singing Dangerously Again. In our last video lesson, we learned about the dangers of singing with glottal shock, which is a clicking that may be heard at the beginning of words that begin with a vowel rather than a consonant. In fact, the first paragraph in today's lesson already contained 32 words, 11 of which started with a vowel. Now that's 11 times in one paragraph only that we could have caused great trauma to the vocal cords themselves. But although the beginning of a word is very common, a point of occurrence of glottal shock, it is not the only part of a phrase where we may hear it. We can also hear glottal shock at the end of phrases or in between the words themselves. We may even hear glottal shock in between notes of a scale or arpeggio. And the most severe cases is when it's all three of these at the same time. The term glottal shock is a combination of the word glottis, which is the open cavity of the throat that begins above and eventually houses the vocal cords. And then, of course, we have the word shock, which is obviously describing the trauma caused by slamming them together. Now, there are other names given to glottal shock that you may come across, such as glottal stop, glottal catch, and so on. All have the same meaning, but suggest different situations. For instance, you may hear the term glottal stop used in singing to explain the click heard when a word ends abruptly. And yet, glottal stop is also often used in linguistics to denote the click between sentence fragments or phonemes, such as uh-oh or uh-uh. These are commonly referred to as stop consonants. Because of these inconsistencies and non-standard use of these terms in singing, we will refer to the clicking attack at the beginning of a word as glottal shock and the abrupt closure at the end of a word as glottal stop. Interestingly, there are numerous languages that employ these sounds regularly in their speech, including many Native American Indian dialects. This to me suggests that there is a degree of normality to glottal shock. But, like many things in singing, too much can simply be too much. And what we get away with as non-singers, we cannot get away with as singers. Remember that singing does sometimes require certain lifestyle changes because we as singers already use the voice more often, with more overall strength, and at a wider note range than non-singers. So we need to take greater care of the voice by avoiding any unnecessary additional stress to the instrument. This just adds to the mix of things, and vocal flaws such as glottal shock may be the one mistake that pushes us over the edge towards vocal cord injury. So what are the approaches to reduce glottal shock? The first approach was to allow the breath to move first, then voice. This can be looked at as adding an H at the word's onset, which of course means that the word no longer begins with a vowel, but rather a consonant. The second approach was to use either of the two vocal ornaments that were mentioned, which were sliding up to the note and or using vocal fry. Both of these ornaments have the ability to at least weaken the severity of glottal shock. But on the negative side, they also have the tendency to be overused, which becomes musically repetitive and should not be relied on as the only means to reduce glottal shock. In fact, the ornament, vocal fry, can not only become repetitive, but also be damaging to the vocal cords in of itself if overused. You will find that there are many teachers of voice who absolutely oppose its usage for this very reason. Now, we here at virtualvoicelessons.net do not hold this position because vocal fry is a bona fide vocal ornament, which is used commonly throughout speech. And speech is of itself, of course, the model for contemporary singing. Interestingly, vocal fry can express its own meaning. We can use it to express pain, mellowness, longing, and so on. So to suggest that one should never use vocal fry is unrealistic and unnecessary, because if we use it sparingly, especially in lower soft singing, which is where it sounds and feels its best anyway, then we will not cause this damage to the vocal folds. So I suggest that if you want to use vocal fry to reduce glottal shock or to express meaning in a phrase, then simply use it sparingly and limit its usage to low, softer singing. So let's start today's session by taking a look at the third and final technique in our fight to remove glottal shock. The last of our three techniques utilizes a very important concept in singing word phrases. We call it bridging the gaps, and it is one of those things that when you apply it, winds up correcting many seemingly unrelated areas. In other words, it's one fix for many needs. The concept is simple. You ready? We need to start each and every phrase with breath and then end with breath with no gaps between. Again, let me repeat that. We need to start each and every phrase with breath and then end with breath with no gaps in between. You see, the problem is this. Many times singers will sing a phrase in a song and unknowing to them may stop the airflow in between words, which results in clicks. And this occurs more often than not as the melody or scale goes down. Again, this occurs more often than not as the melody or scale goes down. This can also happen when we complete one sentence and then the next one immediately follows. You know, sometimes we accidentally stop the flow of air because it's as if the next sentence was minutes away to us. Unfortunately, if the phrases are actually close together, then we can easily glottal shock. You see, we want the air to flow continuously through the phrase and between them as well. I often tell my students that singing is a long, connected thing, and it is. And this holds true even with phrases that are choppy and more upbeat. Now, the starting with breath part of this has been laid out in detail in the prior video lesson called Singing Dangerously. Consonants can be the source of air before we sing, but when there is no consonant, we make up one, which is an H. But of course, the story doesn't end there. We need to have the same air ride all the way through the phrase without faltering. Again, this is like a surfer who, in attempting to ride a wave, he moves the board before the wave hits and then rides it all the way to the end. And if he stops short of the wave's end, the surfer will wipe out. All too often, there may be a certain combination of words or a certain order of notes that will trip up our breath support, leaving little spots where we stop pushing for a moment. Almost always, the little pause may be only a fraction of a second long, but it's long enough that when we restart the flow of air into a vowel, we glottal shock. And singers may do this several times in a single sentence. You see, we need to slide the sentence together. Remember, singing is a long, connected thing. It's supposed to be all slid together, forming a single line rather than a broken line. Even our vocalises require this concept. The concept of bridging the gaps can also be applied between sentences. And as mentioned earlier, this particular concept does fix many other areas other than just glottal shock reduction. If we flow our airstream through each phrase and flow from phrase to phrase as well, our voice will feel and sound generally more in control. When we stop airflow or hold back from pushing through the phrase, we will oftentimes hear shaking in our vocal tone. This will increase our risk of glottal shock and even increase our chances of cracking. One rhyming principle that I often use is this: holding back makes us crack. And this is obviously true. Holding back does make us crack because holding back is the complete opposite of flowing. So, if we want to reduce the damaging results of glottal shock, and if we want to have a smoother voice with more control and greater reduced occurrences of cracking, then we must apply the concept of bridging the gaps by keeping the air flowing through the phrase and when close together between them as well. So let me repeat that. We must keep the air flowing through the phrases and when close together between them as well. It's like starting with an H and never stopping it. Another place to hear little pauses, which results in glottal shock, is during scales, especially when there are big interval jumps between the notes, and even more common is again when the scales are descending. Many singers yesterday, as well as today, use scalar dynamics to enhance their vocal performance. Singers such as Christina Aguilera, Whitney Houston, Mariah Carey, Aretha Franklin, Usher, Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin, Ian Gillan of Deep Purple, and so on, have inspired millions of singers to ornament the voice through the usage of these long, fluttering scales and arpeggios. And it certainly didn't start in contemporary voice. I mean, classical singers are also aware of the usage of scales, as can be heard by listening to vocal pieces by classical composers such as Haydn and Mozart. And although all these singers are all inspiring with what they do, they themselves are not perfect and are subjected to mistakes as well as anyone else. So for us to imitate them, the occurrence of glottal shock may be even more often and even more severe. You know, one common reality to remember with us as vocalists is that when we imitate what other singers are doing, we have the tendency to overstress and basically overdo what they do. We are not them, but we are trying to imitate them. And so we often overdo it. And then to compensate, start relying on old bad habits such as flexing, and in this case, dropping air pressure between notes. An interesting indicator outside of glottal shock that suggests that we dropped our air pressure within the phrase is through the existence of little H's between notes and words. This shows that the phrase stopped for an instant and then restarted. Again, it is an indicator that we are not pushing all the way through the phrase, but instead have little drops in our air pressure, which are again represented by an H. Now, I'm always worried when I mention this to students, as it seems like such a contradiction to the idea that we need to start singing with breath, which can be represented by an H, and yet we should not hear H's in the middle of the phrase. But the contradiction is in actuality non-existent. First of all, what we are striving for at the beginning of a non-vowel word is to make the H so small that it actually sounds as if the act of singing and the act of expiration occurred at the same moment in time. That's the goal that we should all have, to eventually be able to make the H unheard. When singers drop air pressure in between words, just the fact that it's basically an accident tells us the H will never become shorter and shorter because it's an accident. And accidents usually don't wind up improving things more and more throughout time. In fact, they do the opposite. They get worse and worse. The only time I ever hear claims of accidents improving things is through the proponents of the theory of evolution, which to me explains why it remains to this day a theory and not a fact. Secondly, the reason an H sounds like an H to begin with is because it starts from nothing. If you place an H in front of a word, a child can hear that it is indeed an H. If you were to say a word and put the same sound at the end of the word, it would sound nothing more than you exhaled. So therefore, if you're hearing H's in between words, it means that you stopped for a brief moment. Again, H's have to start from nothing. And if you're hearing the H, then nothing was there. You stopped. So again, we should always strive to have our voices ride the wave of air all the way to the end of a phrase because it makes the passage sound smooth, controlled, and most importantly, free of glottal stop and cracking. We don't want to hear these accidental H's within our phrases, as they are the alarm that goes off telling us we are dropping air pressure. And remember, that occurs mostly when we are going down a phrase. Finally, we come to the last portion of today's study, which is how do we end the phrase correctly. As mentioned earlier, we can also click at the end of a word that ends with a vowel as well as the onset. Words such as cry or you or saw are potential problem words. Now let me demonstrate this. Okay, I'm going to do this incorrectly. First, the word cry. Cry. The word you. You. Saw. Saw. Correctly. Cry. You. Saw. Saw. A little bit of breath. So, as you could hear, there was an abrupt closure of the vocal folds causing another click, or in this case, glottal stop. Again, this term has the same meaning as glottal shock, but suggests, of course, again, a different application. What you want to do is always end with air. Just a little, and I stress just a little, because as you probably guessed, whenever I tell a student to let a little air out, they then dump all the air out. This would be a bad breathing habit, as we have learned in our inhaling video lessons. We don't want to dump all the air out of a phrase. All we want is a little H. And of course, it won't really sound like an H because the H has to start from nothing. And just like the attack of a word, the goal that we are striving for is to make the H so short as to sound as if it's not really there at all. So again, we need to start each and every phrase with breath and end with breath with no gaps in between. In our next session that goes along with this series, we will continue developing our understanding and ability to bridge the gaps between words of a song in the video lesson entitled Consonant Connections and the Flowing Nature of Voice. In this lesson, we will take a close look at our English consonants and see just how they can aid us in making our voices flow smoothly, controllable, and free of glottal shock and cracking. I am Stephen J. Childs, and I would like to say thank you and God bless always.